As the blade pierced Pinkie Pie's chest, Rainbow Dash's sanity came sweeping back to her, and she immediately regretted what she did. Trembling, she dropped the bloodied blade, but it was too late. The damage had already been done. Red liquid poured from the huge gash in Pinkie's chest, and all she could do was utter, "But why?" before she collapsed on the ground, her eyes a blank stare. Rainbow stared at Pinkie in disbelief. "Oh, Goddess, what have I done?" Her heart began to pound in her chest as she made sense of the horrible act. She had just assaulted one of her friends like the very monster in her dreams did to her. Panicking, she fell onto her back and started to crawl away from the ghastly scene. Her mind raced with uncertainty of what to do, until finally she let instinct take over. She stood up, spread her wings, and flew out of the door screaming, "Help! Someone help me!" Her frantic cries were heard all across the village. Multiple ponies come to her aid. "What's wrong?" one of them inquired. "It's Pinkie Pie. She's hurt badly," she lamented with tears flowing from her eyes. One of the ponies stuck her head into the bakery and gasped, "Oh, Goddess! Someone get the nurse ponies out here right away!" A nearby Pegasus heard her request and acted immediately, spreading her wings and flying towards the direction of the hospital. The pony that made the request turned her head towards Dash. "How did this happen?" I don't know. She was like that when I arrived." The pony believed her, at least she acted like she did, as she called over other ponies to help the injured mare. Rainbow Dash wanted to help, but her hooves locked up, and she could only stare in wide-eyed terror as she watched her friend slip away as blood seeped from the gaping wound on her chest. A fast response brought many ponies with medical supplies to the scene. With the help of others, the nurses were able to get Pinkie patched up and carried out on the stretcher towards the hospital. While others hurried along to make sure that she would be all right, Rainbow Dash stayed behind, hovering in the air, as she stared off in the distance of the shrinking crowd. "I'm a monster," she said to herself, before she broke down in tears and flew in the opposite direction. After a long ordeal in the emergency room and with all of Pinkie's friends, with the exception of Dash, waiting nervously in the waiting room for news on her friend's status, a nurse pony finally comes to meet them. They immediately crowd around, Twilight asking the question that resounded on everyone's mind. "Tell me, nurse, is she going to live?" The nurse opened her mouth, and all the ponies' hearts stopped in anticipation and news. "Yes." All the ponies sighed with relief. "Oh, thanks, Celestia," Twilight expressed. "It was a close call for a while, but we managed to save her. She's recovering now," the nurse pony explained. "Do you know who did this to her?" Applejack inquired. The nurse pony shook her head. "I'm afraid not, although she was mumbling something as we operated on her. Very soft, so I don't know if I heard it correctly. I think it was Rainbow Y." All the ponies gasped, staring at each other in disbelief. Rainbow Dash huddled beneath a tree with her wings folded across her chest, hooves locked across her knees, as she stared at the ground miserably. Many thoughts raced through her mind. She kept reliving the events that just transpired at the bakery, each more vivid and horrifying than the last. How could I have done such a thing? The question reeled in her mind. She gripped her head and started to rock back and forth until the memories of the assault overwhelmed her, and she wailed in misery. "I found her!" Rainbow Dash heard suddenly, It snapped her out of her trance. She lowered her hooves and looked up to see Twilight and the rest of her friends paddling towards her. They stopped. Applejack was the first to confront. "Tell me, Rainbow Dash, did you do this to Pinkie?" Dash looked down at the ground in shame and muttered yes. Applejack frowned as her eyes furrowed. She turned away, giving her the cold shoulder, only to suddenly buck her legs hard into Rainbow Dash's snout. Dash's head snapped back before slamming against a tree trunk. She collapsed against it, splotches of blood pooling on the grass between her legs, as she gripped her thoroughly bleeding snout with a hoof. It wasn't broken, but she knew Applejack could have easily done that, so had she wanted to. Seems she wasn't quite willing to go that far. She turned back around, boiling anger plastered on her face as she barked, "A friend who attacks another friend like that is no friend of mine!" And with that she ran off. Rainbow Dash lowered her head without saying a word as Applejack trotted away. Rarity was next. She didn't hesitate to bring a hoof hard against the side of her face. Blood flung from her bleeding snout from the sheer force of that, and Rainbow Dash gripped her now throbbing cheekbone with the other free hoof as she looked in shame. "How could you?" Rarity scorned, before she ran off with tears in her eyes. Then was Fluttershy, just as angry as the others. She raised her hoofs in preparation to strike, who closed her eyes in tense. However, she felt light lumps. She opened her eyes back to see Fluttershy batting at her futilely in rage as her eyes started to water up. Eventually, she couldn't take the hurt anymore and flew off. Fluttershy's assault hurt the worst. One by one, friends abandoned her. She couldn't blame them. She didn't deserve their friendship, not after what she'd done. All that was left was Twilight Sparkle, staring at her with furrowed eyes, not saying a word. Dash broke the silent tension. "Twilight, Why, Rainbow Dash? Why would you do such a terrible thing?" she inquired. Dash breathed in deep. She was hesitant to speak of the horrors she experienced, but she knew she had to. It'll have to be the first step she needs to take, should she want to find redemption for her actions. After a long exhale, she told Twilight everything that she had kept bottling up for so long. Nightmares. Such terrifying nightmares. I could see Pinkie Pie standing over me with a scalpel, ready to cut into my flesh, ripping out my organs. It was awful. Horrible. Every night it was the same until I started reliving it every waking hour. The next thing I knew, she was offering me cupcakes. Those cupcakes that she used in the nightmares to subdue me so she could mutilate me at her own pace. I panicked. I grabbed the closest weapon I could find, and that's when I attacked her. Twilight couldn't believe her ears. She had no idea her friend was slowly going mad. She immediately wrapped her arms around her and held her tight. "Dash, I'm so sorry. I can't begin to imagine what you were going through. I wish I could have been there for you." Dash cried on her shoulder as Twilight embraced her, consoling her as best she could. Blood dripped onto her shoulder. She didn't care, though. Her friend needed her right now. The embrace outlasted the tears and blood. Once Dash finally calmed down, Twilight said to her, "You have to tell Pinkie Pie what happened." Dash became frightened. "No, I couldn't. She wouldn't want to see me after what I've done. Look, you're scared. I know, but as far as Pinkie knows, you did this on purpose. Do you want her to think that?" Dash's eyes widened at the prospect of it. Terrifying as she was of Pinkie Pie reacting to see her, the thought of her believing the attack was one of spite or anger or anything it was too much to bear. With newfound resolve, she stood up and said, "Lead the way." Twilight smiled and nodded. "You're doing the right thing, but first, we need to get you cleaned up." Rainbow Dash forgot momentarily of the physical pain and the mess of her bleeding snout. Oh, yeah, that. So the two headed to a nearby fountain. Though ponies turned their heads in piqued interest of Rainbow Dash's bruises, they didn't confront. Some even whispered among themselves. When she glanced them, they turned away. Were they afraid of her? Rainbow Dash wondered. She couldn't blame them if they did. She was a monster, after all. Dash dipped her head in the fountain, washing off the blood staining her face and hooves. Once cleaned, she nodded to Twilight, who led her towards the hospital. When they reached the steps, Dash froze. She suddenly found herself doubting her reasons. She's not going to want to see me. She's going to hate me more. She thought further and further, but a comforting hoof on the shoulder roused Rainbow Dash from her paranoid illusions. Twilight nodded, and Dash took a deep breath before taking the last steps into the hospital. The place was pretty vacant. A few sickly ponies lounging about, waiting impatiently for the doctor to see them. Nothing serious. At least nothing compared to Rainbow Dash's act of cruelty. Twilight went to the front desk and asked if to see her. Nurse Pony nodded and directed them to one of the back rooms. Twilight called out to Rainbow Dash to follow, and she reluctantly did. They came to the bedroom in the back. The nurse pony showed them the door. She said something about keeping the visit short before trotting off. Dash floated up to the glass window of the door and peered inside. Inside, it made her heart sink. Pinky, lying in the bed, bandages wrapped around her chest, a tube connected to a blood bag on her right hoof. What truly made Rainbow Dash feel terrible was that she looked so weak. She's resting for the time being, but her breathing was soft and eyes, although closed, looked so sad. Dash lost control. She began to cry. "I can't do this, Twilight." Being supportive as she could, Twilight put a hoof on her shoulder. "You've come this far. You can't quit now. Go in there and talk to her." Dash sighed. She knew Twilight was right. She had to see her, to tell her how sorry she was. With a deep breath, she reached for the door handle and pulled. The door opened with ease. Dash floated in silently. She could see Pinkie Pie so clearly. Weak, helpless, made her heart ache. She stepped towards her and lowered herself next to Pinkie Pie's bedside. She looked over the injury she had wrought. While the gash had been covered, blood splotches along the bandages gave her a perfect idea of how serious it was. Tears formed in her eyes as she gripped the pink pony's dangling hoof with her own and squeezed. "Pinkie, I'm so sorry. So very, very sorry." She wept on her bedside, the sheets soaking most of the tears. Pinkie was roused from her slumber. She opened her eyes weakly and stared at the ceiling. She heard weeping. Turning her head, she noticed Rainbow Dash sitting next to her. Her face lit up and a smile spread across her cheeks. "Ashy, is that you?" Dash looked up. The way Pinkie was smiling, it put her at a loss. Why was she smiling? I almost killed her. "It is you. I'm so glad you came by. I was so worried about you when you didn't show up with the rest of the friends." "Worried? About me? Why?" "Because you're my best friend, silly filly," she exclaimed cheerfully. For the first time of her life, Dash felt true sadness. The very pony she almost murdered not only still considered her a friend, but her best friend. Rainbow Dash felt new tears forming in her eyes, and she looked at Pinkie Pie with extreme sadness, her lips quivering. Pinkie cocked her head at her. "What's wrong?" "Pinkie, please forgive me. I don't know why I did what I did. I can't express how sorry I am," she lamented as tears flowed from her eyes. Pinkie reached up and wiped the tears away. "Don't cry, it's okay. I forgive you. I know you would never do something like that intentionally. Best friends forgive each other no matter what." Dash smiled widely, tears of joy replacing the sad ones, as she hugged Pinkie Pie lovingly, but being careful not to jostle her. "Thank you, Pinkie. Anything for you, Dash." As it all went down, Twilight watched from the window. As she saw the events transpire before her, she just couldn't help but smile. Good for them, she said to herself, before trotting off to find her friends. They have to know the truth. Dash stayed with Pinkie until a nurse came to inform her the visiting hours were over. Dash didn't want to leave, but she knew the importance of a good bed rest, especially for an injured pony like Pinkie, and did what was best. With a long embracing hug, the two parted ways, and Rainbow Dash finally headed home. She idly considered going to talk to the other fillies that were so upset with her, but convinced herself it was too soon. When she got to her cloud house, she stared at her bed with uncertainty. This was where the nightmares began. She feared they would happen tonight. However, she was far too exhausted for a long ordeal to consider any alternative. Despite the physical pain, she had little trouble succumbing to the sweet respite of sleep. The nightmares didn't haunt her. In the morning, Dash felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Well rested. Although she still is in a bit of pain from physical injury, it was now at a tolerable level. It'll take a few more days for the bruises to heal, much longer for the emotional ones, but she was still happy for the first time in a long time, and she wasted no time getting out of bed to start the day. With a warm, relaxing bath to get the knots out of joints, and a thorough grooming session to fix the horribly mangled mane and tail, she decided to head off to see Pinkie in the hospital. Before she made it very far, though, a thought crossed her mind. A light went on in her head. With a smile, she changed directions and headed towards Pinkie's bakery. When she arrived, the first thing she noticed was the bakery was void of life. To be expected, since it was only recently the scene of a crime. Dash swooped into the doorway to look around. Pretty much the way they left it. The bloodstains were clear, though, and the weapon used in the assault was removed. Dash was relieved, but she didn't want to be reminded of the horrific attack. Wasting no time, Dash collected up a Pinkie Pie cookbook and proceeded to read through a certain cupcake recipe. With a bit of trial and error, Dash finally managed to make some cupcakes that she thought was of acceptable quality. She topped them off each with a different type of icing before she collects them into a basket and carried it out the door on her wings. She stopped in her tracks when she arrived just outside the door. Waiting for her outside were her former friends and Twilight. Rarity was the first to step forward. When she was close enough, she raised her hoof. Dash closed her eyes and turned her head, grimacing, as she was prepared herself for another hard smack, but it never arrived. Instead, it was a hoof rest on the shoulder. Dash turned her head back towards Rarity and opened her eyes, and to her surprise, Rarity was smiling. "Twilight explained everything to us. To think that you were suffering like that, it's absolutely dreadful. Therefore, I'm sorry for hitting you. I should have given you a chance to explain first. Can you forgive me?" "No, you don't need to apologize. I deserved it for what I've done. I should be the one begging you for forgiveness. Well, how about we both say sorry together? Sounds fair. After a 3 count, the two said sorry in unison. They smiled at each other and hugged it out. Next was Fluttershy, who wrapped her hooves around Rainbow Dash and squeezed tight. Dash returned the embrace. No words exchanged, but Rainbow Dash didn't need them, as the sudden wetness on their shoulder expressed Fluttershy's feelings perfectly. Lastly was Applejack. Expression was that of anger still, so it seemed. As she still had her eyes furrowed at Dash, she walked to her. Dash's smile faded as she watched AJ with uncertainty while she closed the gap between them. Then AJ sat down and stared sharply. It was a long, uncomfortable silence, but eventually AJ broke the tension with a sigh. If everyone else can forgive you, I suppose I can too. Friends again? Dash's smile returned. Friends again, she replied as she pressed her free hoof against hers. Twilight stepped forward. We all wanted you to know we loved you and that we will always be here for you no matter what. Thanks, guys. I love you too, Dash replied as a tear rolled down her cheek. Now, let's go visit Pinkie Pie, Twilight concluded. All agreed in unison. They arrived at a hospital a short time later, and it took a short time for the nurse pony to escort them. As usual, Pinkie was delighted to see all her friends, most of all Rainbow Dash, and they all gave her a proper greeting with a hug and a get well soon. Pinkie, I have something for you, Dash said, after they greeted. Ooh, what could it be? She inquired with enthusiasm. Dash smiled and placed the basket on the blankets covering her stomach. And then she removed cupcakes. Cupcakes for me? Yep. Dash grabbed one with a hoof and immediately began to nibble on it. Good, she said with her mouth full. What a thoughtful gift. Well, you know, that's how I roll, she responded. Finally, she was sounding like her old self again. Pinkie reached for another one, brought it up to her mouth, and then stopped, as she stared at the other mares gathered around her. Something wrong, dear? Rarity inquired. There is something wrong, Pinkie said glumly, as she lowered and returning the cupcake to the basket. The other's expressions turned to dread. Pinkie's expression changed to happiness again. You guys haven't had a taste yet. She held out the basket to all her friends. The others smiled and they took a cupcake for themselves. Wow! Y'all made these, Rainbow Dash? They're delicious, Applejack praised. Very much so, Fluttershy added cheerfully. Dash rubbed the back of her head, blushing at all the praise. Ah, shucks, guys. She glanced over each other as they ate and smiled to herself. They weren't just her friends. They were her comrades. Ponies that would always be there for her, even through the worst of times. Now and forever. She was truly blessed. All 6 talked as they ate, breaking only to take another bite of the cupcakes. Joked, they laughed. Most importantly, they hung out like best friends should. Visiting hours ended as the ponies said their goodbyes and headed off towards their respective homes. Except for Dash. She had been behind her work after all. There's a lot of catching up to do. So she worked busily for the rest of the day, clearing clouds and making sure it rained where it needed to. For the first time in a long time, Dash had the spunk back, and she wasn't about to let it go to waste. Nightmares returned, but it wasn't the same as before. In time, she saw herself standing over Pinkie Pie, ready to dig the scalpel into her chest. And the moment she did, she woke up screaming. Moments later, there was a hoof on her shoulder, and she gasped out of fright. She swerved her head to see Fluttershy hovering over her. Fluttershy, what? I snuck I sneaked in after you went to sleep. I was worried you had those awful nightmares. I don't want you to be alone. Don't be mad, please." She wasn't angry. On the contrary, she was grateful and confided in the details of the nightmare. "Oh, how terrible! We can't have you dreaming about such horrid things. I'll stay with you and make sure those nightmares don't bother you again." Dash smiled. "Thanks, Fluttershy." They curled up into bed, and when Dash finally managed to fall back to sleep, it was soundly for the rest of the night. The next day, Fluttershy encouraged Dash to tell her friends about her nightmares, and she followed the advice. As they heard about it, they all agreed to help out by letting Rainbow Dash stay in their homes until the nightmare stopped. She was happy to oblige. Over the next few days, she repeated the process of making cupcakes for Pinkie Pie, sharing them with her and her friends. As visiting hours ended, she returned to chores. By the time night came, she headed not to her own home, but to the home of her friends. They were always willing to accommodate her with whatever she needed, and were always by her side to comfort her as her nightmares returned. But every night her nightmares came few and far in between. 2 weeks later, Pinkie was released from the hospital. Though she had a clean bill of health, she was still encouraged to take it easy for the next few weeks. She wore no more bandages, but the scar from the assault remained, a grim reminder to all of her friends of what Rainbow Dash did to her. But Rainbow Dash treated it as a sign to never forget the friendship that they had for each other. As for the nightmares, with constant help and support of her friends, they never bothered her again. The end.